I want to show you two meetings that happened in the same 48-hour window, because nobody has put them side by side yet. And once you see them together, you cannot unsee what they mean. On June 26, 2026, the foreign ministers of France, Germany, and Italy issued a joint statement declining to send naval forces to the American-led coalition patrolling the Strait of Hormuz. They called instead for a diplomatic settlement, including partial sanctions relief for Iran. On the very same weekend, quietly, without press cameras, an Iranian energy delegation met with representatives from 3 European utility companies in Vienna to discuss what one leaked memo described as long-term supply security arrangements. Not a summit, not a headline. A working meeting about gas and oil contracts, held while the diplomatic fireworks over Hormuz were still going off in public view. Officially, the story out of Washington is that Europe is simply being cautious, staying out of a conflict that is not its own, exercising the ordinary prudence you would expect from allies who have their own domestic politics to manage. That is the comfortable explanation, and I understand why people accept it. It requires nothing uncomfortable to be true. But I want to spend the next 20 minutes showing you why that explanation cannot survive contact with the second meeting, the quiet one in Vienna. Because the real question is not why Europe is staying neutral in public. The real question is this: did Iran deliberately and patiently construct a situation where European governments would be forced to choose between their energy security and their alliance with Washington? And did Europe quietly already make that choice? Because if the answer is yes, then what looks like European caution is actually the first visible crack in the oldest and most important alliance structure in the modern world. Okay, let's get into it. The first thing I need to give you is a concept from economics that explains almost everything else in this story. And it is a concept most people intuitively understand without ever having a name for it. Economists call it the energy trilemma. Every national government, when it thinks about energy policy, is trying to balance 3 things at once: security of supply, meaning you actually get the energy you need without interruption; affordability, meaning your population and industry are not crushed by the price; and alignment, meaning your energy choices do not conflict with your broader foreign policy and security relationships. Under normal circumstances, a government can balance all 3 reasonably well. But when one of those 3 legs gets kicked hard enough, the other 2 start fighting each other, and a government is forced to sacrifice one to protect the other 2. Europe already lived through one brutal lesson in this trilemma. When Russian pipeline gas was cut off following the invasion of Ukraine, European governments discovered in the most painful way possible what happens when security of supply collapses. Industrial production stalled. Households faced heating bills that triggered actual government collapses in more than one country. The lesson that every European finance ministry absorbed from that experience, and absorbed permanently, is this: energy insecurity is not an abstract geopolitical inconvenience. It is a direct threat to domestic political survival. Governments that cannot keep the lights on and the factories running do not survive the next election, regardless of how correct their foreign policy positions might be. Now hold that lesson in your mind, because Iran and the people advising Iran understood something crucial about it. They understood that the Strait of Hormuz is not just a military choke point. It is the single most consequential energy security lever remaining on the planet. And Europe, having already been burned once by supply insecurity, was the single most psychologically vulnerable major power to a second shock of exactly that kind. If you wanted to find the one pressure point where a smaller power could make the world's wealthiest alliance bloc genuinely hesitate, the Strait of Hormuz, aimed directly at post-2022 Europe, is close to a perfect selection. Let me walk you through exactly how this pressure was applied, because the sequencing matters enormously, and it was not accidental. 20% of the entire world's seaborne oil trade moves through the Strait of Hormuz. That number alone is significant, but it understates the specific vulnerability for Europe. European refineries are configured through decades of infrastructure investment around specific crude blends that flow disproportionately from Gulf producers. You cannot simply swap Gulf crude for American shale crude overnight without expensive refinery retooling, because the chemistry is different and the equipment is calibrated for what it has always processed. That means when Gulf supply through Hormuz is threatened, Europe faces not just a price shock, but a genuine physical substitution problem that takes years, not weeks, to solve. Iran did not need to close the strait to weaponize this vulnerability. It only needed to make closure a credible, standing possibility. The IRGC's public assertions of operational control over passage through the strait, the demonstrated willingness to strike shipping and coastal infrastructure, all of it accomplishes the goal without Iran ever having to accept the enormous costs of an actual full closure. This is the crucial distinction between a threat and an action. A threat, if credible enough, produces almost the same behavioral change in your target as the action itself, at a fraction of the cost to the party making it. European shipping insurers understood this immediately. War risk premiums for Gulf transits rose sharply, and once insurance costs rise, the economics of every single voyage through that strait shifts, whether or not a single additional missile is ever fired. Now, overlay the sanctions relief question onto that same picture. Throughout the negotiations, Iran has consistently tied any de-escalation, any guarantee of continued safe passage, to specific and partial relief from the sanctions architecture that primarily serves American strategic interests rather than European ones. And here is the detail that I think explains the entire European calculation better than anything else. European governments were never being asked to abandon Washington outright. They were being offered a much narrower and much more tempting proposition. Stay formally aligned with the American position rhetorically, while quietly supporting, or at least not actively blocking, a partial sanctions relief framework that reduces the Hormuz risk premium and secures your own energy supply. That is not a request for European betrayal. It is a request for European self-interest to be allowed to operate without public embarrassment. And that is a far easier thing for a government to say yes to. This is where the Vienna meeting becomes the piece of evidence that changes the entire picture, because it shows you what European governments actually did once nobody was watching, as opposed to what they said in public while everyone was. The joint statement declining naval participation was, on its face, deniable. Governments can frame declining a military commitment as caution, as burden-sharing disagreements, as 100 things that have nothing to do with energy calculations. But a quiet working meeting between an Iranian energy delegation and European utility representatives discussing long-term supply security arrangements in the same window as that public statement is not deniable in the same way. That is not caution. That is active positioning. That is European energy companies, almost certainly with at least tacit government awareness, given how tightly regulated European strategic energy relationships are, exploring what a post-sanctions relief supply relationship with Iran could look like, before the formal politics have even caught up. Think about what that timing tells you. You do not send an energy delegation to explore long-term supply arrangements with a country whose future access to global markets you consider genuinely uncertain. You send that delegation when you have already made an internal calculation that some version of sanctions relief and some version of continued safe Hormuz passage is coming, and you want your economy positioned to benefit from it rather than caught flat-footed by it. The public caution and the private positioning are not contradictory. They are two halves of the same strategy. Manage the alliance relationship carefully in public while protecting your own economic interests in private. And let the ambiguity between the two statements buy you time before anyone has to make the choice explicit. And this is exactly the outcome Iran was engineering. Iran did not need Europe to publicly break with Washington. A public break would have been messy, would have triggered its own backlash, would have handed Washington a clean narrative about European betrayal. What Iran needed, and what it appears to have gotten, was something quieter and ultimately more durable. European governments and European industry beginning to act, in their private planning and their private commercial relationships, as though the American-led sanctions and coalition architecture is no longer the only framework worth planning around. That is not a dramatic rupture. It is something more corrosive, a slow transfer of practical weight away from the alliance framework, happening beneath the level of headlines, in exactly the kind of venue: energy contracts, utility negotiations, long-term supply planning that rarely makes the news, but ultimately determines how nations actually behave when the theoretical becomes concrete. I want to widen the lens now because this pattern, a smaller power using energy dependency to fracture a larger alliance's unity, has a precise historical precedent, and it is worth understanding in detail because the parallels are strikingly close. In the winter of 1973, the Arab members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo against the United States and several of its allies in response to American support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The embargo itself lasted only a matter of months, and in narrow military terms, it achieved nothing directly. No territory changed hands because of it. No army was defeated because of it. But its actual strategic effect was enormous, and it operated through exactly the mechanism I have been describing tonight. European nations, heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil and lacking America's comparatively larger domestic production base at the time, faced immediate and severe economic pain. And several of them responded not by closing ranks with Washington, but by quietly distancing themselves from American Middle East policy, issuing statements more sympathetic to Arab positions than Washington found comfortable, precisely because their energy vulnerability made unconditional alliance solidarity too expensive to sustain. The embargo did not end the Atlantic Alliance. NATO survived it. But it permanently demonstrated something that had been true in theory but had never been tested in practice. That European commitment to American Middle East policy was not unconditional. And that when the price of solidarity became high enough, expressed specifically through energy costs that hit voters directly in their household budgets, European governments would find diplomatic language to create distance rather than pay that price in full. Henry Kissinger himself, in later reflections on that period, described the embargo's political effect as more significant than its economic effect, precisely because of what it revealed about the actual, as opposed to theoretical, cohesion of the Western alliance under energy pressure. The lesson from 1973 is not that alliances are fake. It is that alliance solidarity has always had a price ceiling, a point past which the domestic political cost of standing with your ally exceeds what any government, even a genuinely committed one, can sustain. Smaller powers who understand where that ceiling sits do not need to defeat a great alliance militarily. They only need to apply pressure precisely at the point where that ceiling is lowest, and watch the cracks appear on their own. Iran, whether through its own historical study or through the accumulated strategic education passed along by its Russian and Chinese partners, both of whom have spent decades studying exactly this kind of alliance fracture, appears to understand this lesson at least as well as the oil ministers of 1973 did. Now, I want to give real weight to the strongest counter-argument here because I think it deserves serious engagement rather than a dismissal. The case against everything I have just laid out would go something like this. European governments have declined military commitments to American-led coalitions many times before, for many reasons that have nothing to do with secret energy capitulation. European domestic politics are famously fractious. Coalition governments in France, Germany, and Italy all face genuine internal constraints. War weariness after Ukraine, budget pressures, and legitimate policy disagreements about the wisdom of further Middle East military entanglement that predate this specific crisis by years. A single meeting between an Iranian energy delegation and European utilities, especially one described only through a leaked memo rather than confirmed on the record, is thin evidence for a sweeping claim about the alliance fracturing. Companies explore contingency options constantly, without those explorations reflecting settled government policy, and treating ordinary commercial due diligence as proof of geopolitical realignment risks, reading far too much into what may simply be prudent business planning by firms that explore every possible future, regardless of which one they expect to materialize. This is a genuinely strong objection, and I want to be honest about where it lands. It is entirely true that European reluctance to join military coalitions has deep and legitimate roots that predate this specific episode, and it would be sloppy analysis to attribute every instance of European caution to a single cause. It is also true that energy companies routinely explore contingency planning that never becomes policy, and a single leaked memo about a meeting is not, on its own, proof of a coordinated government strategy. But here is what that argument has difficulty fully explaining. The timing correlation between the public statement and the private meeting is not on its own damning, But it becomes much harder to dismiss as coincidence when you consider what it would have cost European governments to prevent that meeting from happening, or at minimum, to keep it from leaking if they genuinely wanted to avoid even the appearance of hedging against the American-led framework. Governments that are serious about alliance discipline typically discourage precisely this kind of ambiguous private contact during a live crisis, because they understand exactly how it will read if it becomes public. The fact that this contact happened, and happened in a way that became visible, suggests either a genuine failure of alliance discipline within European capitals, which is itself revealing, or a calculated tolerance for that kind of hedging, because the underlying energy calculation was judged important enough to accept the risk of exposure. Neither of those explanations supports the comfortable story that this was simply routine caution with no connection to the Hormuz pressure campaign. So where does that leave us, and what specifically should you watch in the weeks ahead to test whether this analysis holds up? The first thing to watch is whether any formal, government-level European energy agreement with Iran emerges in the coming months, distinct from informal contingency exploration. A signed framework, even a modest one, tied explicitly or implicitly to sanctions relief, would confirm that the Vienna-style contacts were the leading edge of settled policy rather than isolated commercial curiosity. The second thing to watch is the language coming out of Washington's own diplomatic channels toward its European partners. If American officials begin using notably harder language about European reliability, about the durability of transatlantic energy and security cooperation, that is a signal that Washington itself has picked up on exactly the dynamic I have described tonight and is worried enough about it to start applying counterpressure of its own. And the third thing to watch is the war risk insurance premium on Gulf shipping over the next quarter. If that premium continues to climb or holds at elevated levels, despite diplomatic talk of de-escalation, it tells you that the market, which has no interest in geopolitical narratives and every interest in accurately pricing real risk, still believes the Hormuz threat is a live, credible lever rather than a resolved one. And as long as the market believes that, the pressure on European energy calculations that I have described tonight does not go away. It simply continues quietly shaping decisions that will not become fully visible in public policy for months or years to come. Here's the question I want to leave you with. For nearly 80 years, the foundation of the transatlantic alliance rested on an assumption so basic it was rarely even stated aloud: that shared strategic interest would always outweigh short-term economic pain when the two came into conflict. Tonight I have shown you a smaller power that appears to have identified with real precision the exact price point at which that assumption stops holding, and applied pressure directly there, not through military confrontation with Europe, but through a single, narrow choke point that European governments cannot afford to treat as a distant, abstract concern. If a regional power with a fraction of America's military budget can locate and exploit the one pressure point that makes the world's most powerful alliance bloc quietly hedge its bets, what does that tell you about how durable the assumptions underneath the entire post-war order actually are, once someone finally decides to test them directly? Think about that.